The lights in the chamber were too bright, and every eye in the room was pointed at me. I counted 11 species sitting around that circular table, and not one of them looked comfortable. Their council chairs curved and bent to fit bodies that had never been human. Some had too many limbs, some had none that I could see. All of them were staring at me like I was a specimen pulled out of a jar. My name is Ethan Cole. 3 months ago, I was one of 12 Marines assigned to hold a supply outpost on a rock called Karn. Today, I was the only one of them still breathing, sitting alone in front of the Interspecies War Council, answering questions I never expected to be asked. The being at the center of the table was called Administrator Vel, a tall, pale creature with silver eyes and a voice that came out flat, like a machine reading a report. Vel folded 4 long fingers together and leaned forward. "We have run the numbers 1,000 times, Vel said. Our analysts cannot make them work. So we will ask you directly, soldier. What is the kill ratio for one Earth Marine?" The question hung in the air. Nobody moved. I could hear the soft hum of the translator device clipped to my collar, turning my English into a dozen alien tongues at once. I did not answer right away. I let the silence sit there, because I wanted them to feel it the way I had felt it back on Karn, in the middle of the night, waiting for something to happen. "You want a number," I said finally. "I can give you one, but it won't mean anything unless you understand where it comes from. Numbers like that don't come from a lab. They come from people, from choices, from the last 30 seconds before everything ends." A representative from a species with plated skin and clicking mandibles interrupted me. Its name, translated, meant something close to Marshal Yoren. "We do not require a story, human. We require data. Give us the ratio." "With respect, Marshal," I said, "you already have the data. You've read every report from Karn. You know the numbers on paper. What you don't know is why they're true. And if you don't understand why, that number will never make sense to you. It'll just look like a mistake in your files." Vel raised a thin hand, silencing the Marshal before he could argue further. "Let him speak. We have waited 3 months for this meeting. We can spare the time." I nodded my thanks and looked around the table one more time. These were the leaders of a coalition that had fought wars for centuries before humanity ever left its own solar system. They had defeated empires, they had erased entire fleets from the stars, and yet here they were, unable to explain how 12 Marines on a forgotten outpost had held off 3 legions for 6 days. I closed my eyes for a moment, and I was back there. Not in this chamber, but in the dust and heat of Karn, with the outpost lights flickering and the horizon full of ships that did not belong to us. "It started on a morning like any other," I said, opening my eyes again. "We had no idea it would be the last quiet morning any of us would see." I told them about the outpost first, because I needed them to understand what we were defending. Karn was not a fortress. It was a supply depot, built fast and cheap on a dry, rocky world with 2 suns and almost no atmosphere worth mentioning. Our job was simple: watch the depot, keep the fuel reserves safe, wait for the next rotation of Marines to arrive and relieve us. Nothing about it was supposed to be dangerous. 12 of us were stationed there. I gave the council their names, one at a time, because I wanted every person in that room to understand that this was not a story about weapons. It was a story about people. There was Marcus Bell, our squad leader, a quiet man from a farming town who spoke slowly and thought even slower, but never once made a decision he regretted. There was Grace Doyle, our combat medic, who could talk anyone through pain just by the sound of her voice. There was Noah Prescott, the youngest of us, barely 2 years out of training, still learning how to laugh at the right moments. There was Olivia Marsh, sharp as a blade, always first to notice when something was wrong. And there were 7 others whose names I gave to the council in full, because I did not want their memory reduced to a statistic. We were not an elite unit, I told them. We were not chosen for this. We were ordinary soldiers, doing an ordinary job, on a world nobody cared about, until the day everybody cared. Administrator Vel's silver eyes narrowed slightly. You are saying the outcome at Karn was not the result of superior training or superior technology. I'm saying it started as an accident, I said. Nobody planned to make a stand there. We just happened to be standing when the fighting started, and none of us knew how to stop. The marshal made a clicking sound that I understood, even through the translator, to be disbelief. 3 legions were dispatched to secure that outpost. 3, against 12 of you. Explain to this council how that engagement was even close. I will, I said, but first you need to understand what that outpost meant to us, because that's where the number you're chasing actually begins. It doesn't begin with weapons, it begins with a decision each of us made, alone, in the dark, before the first shot was ever fired. I paused, letting that settle over the room. On the 5th night before the attack, Marcus called us together, I continued. Command had sent a warning. Enemy scouts had been detected near our system. Nothing confirmed, nothing certain, just a warning. He told us we had 2 options. We could request evacuation and abandon the depot, or we could hold our position and wait for reinforcements that were, at best, 4 days away. And you chose to remain, Vel said. It was not a question. We chose to remain, I confirmed. Not because we were fearless, not because we didn't understand the risk. We stayed because that depot fed 3 other outposts along the frontier. If we left, thousands of soldiers further down the line would run out of supplies within a month. We stayed because leaving meant someone else would pay for it later. I watched several council members exchange glances. I could not read their expressions, not fully, but I understood enough to know that this detail surprised them. In their reports, our decision to hold Karn had been listed as a tactical necessity, ordered from above. They did not know it had been our own choice, made by 12 people sitting in a mess hall with cold coffee going colder. 3 days after that meeting, the scouts became something else, I said. Sensors picked up 3 separate fleets converging on our position, not scouting anymore, an invasion. The room was completely silent now. Even the marshal had stopped clicking his mandibles. We had no fleet of our own to call on, I continued. No orbital defense. What we had was a perimeter fence, a handful of turrets that were older than some of us, and whatever we could build with our own hands in 72 hours. I told them about those 72 hours in detail, because I wanted them to understand that nothing about what happened next was luck. Marcus organized us into 3 teams. Grace turned the medical bay into a fortified shelter, stacking supply crates around the walls and rigging emergency lighting that would not fail if the main power went down. Noah and Olivia worked with 2 engineers to rebuild the aging turret systems, stripping parts from unused vehicles to keep the guns firing longer than their design ever intended. I spent those 3 days digging trenches around the depot's outer wall, running communication lines, and setting traps in the open ground beyond the fence, using whatever scrap and explosive charges we had left in storage. None of us slept more than a few hours at a time. None of us complained. By the time the first ships entered orbit, we were as ready as 12 people could be against 3 legions, I said. Which is to say, we were not ready at all, but we were determined, and determination changes what a person is capable of in ways your data cannot easily measure. Vel tilted its head slightly, a gesture I had learned over the past hour meant genuine curiosity. You believe determination altered the outcome more than equipment or training. I believe it multiplied both, I said. A frightened soldier with a good weapon will still miss. A soldier who has already decided he is not leaving that position will find a way to make every shot count, even with a bad one. That's not something you can put into a formula, but it's real, and it's the first piece of the answer you're looking for. The marshal leaned forward, his plated skin catching the light. And when the attack began, what happened then? I took a slow breath. This was the part of the story that still lived behind my eyes every time I closed them, the part I had not spoken aloud to anyone until this moment. The first wave hit us, just before dawn, I said. Their transports dropped outside the fence line, further out than we expected, which gave us a few extra minutes we did not plan for. Marcus used those minutes well. He got every one of us into position before the first line of infantry ever reached the trenches. I explained how the ground shook under the weight of the landing craft, how the horizon filled with shapes we had only seen before in briefing photographs, how the air itself seemed to change the moment the enemy stepped onto Karn's surface. I told them about the sound, a low mechanical roar that never fully stopped for the next 6 days, and how strange it was that after the first few hours, none of us noticed it anymore. Fear, I explained, does not disappear. It just becomes part of the background, the same way the twin suns became part of the background, the same way the dust in our lungs became part of the background. The first assault was meant to test our defenses, I said. Your marshal will know this better than I do. Standard doctrine across most militaries is to send a smaller force first, see how the defenders respond, then commit the larger force once weaknesses are identified. The marshal's expression, or what I could interpret of it, shifted slightly. That is correct. Your first wave did not survive long enough to report anything useful, I said quietly. That was the first number that confused your analysts, wasn't it? 12 defenders should not have been able to fully repel an organized assault force in under 20 minutes. Nobody answered, which was its own kind of answer. I'm not telling you this to boast, I said, and I meant it. I'm telling you because it's the truth, and the truth is the only thing that will make sense of the number you came here to get. What happened at Karn was not a miracle. It was 12 people who had already decided, days before the fighting started, exactly what they were willing to do to protect something that mattered to them. Your legions did not fight 12 soldiers that morning. They fought 12 decisions that had already been made and could not be unmade by fear. Vel was quiet for a long moment, studying me with those pale silver eyes. When it finally spoke, its voice had lost some of its flatness. Continue, Vel said. Tell us what happened after the first wave fell. I nodded, because I knew this story was only beginning, and the council needed to hear all of it before they would understand the answer they had summoned me here to give. After the first wave, I said, your commanders stopped testing us. They started trying to end it. I let the words sit in the air for a moment, because I wanted every member of that council to feel the weight shift in the room, the same way it had shifted on Karn the instant the second wave lit up our sensors. This was where the real fighting began. This was where I lost the first of my friends, and this was where the number they wanted so badly started to take a shape none of their formulas could explain. If you want to understand the answer, I said, you need to hear what happened next. The second wave arrived 4 hours after the first, and this time they came with numbers that made our trench line look like a child's drawing in the dirt. I told the council how the sky over Karn had changed color that afternoon, turning a strange orange as hundreds of enemy craft entered the atmosphere at once. Marcus called us together over the comm line, and his voice was steady, the same voice he always used, but I could hear something underneath it that had not been there that morning. He told us the second wave outnumbered the first by a factor of 10. He told us command still had not confirmed a rescue timeline. And then he told us something I have never forgotten, because it was the exact moment I understood what kind of fight we were actually in. He said the depot was still standing, the fuel reserves were still intact, and as long as that remained true, we had already done our job. Everything after that point, he said, was simply about seeing how long we could keep doing it. I explained to the council that this idea, holding a position simply because it was still possible to hold it, became the heartbeat of everything that followed. It was not about winning in the way their doctrine understood winning. It was about refusing to stop, 1 minute at a time, for as long as our bodies would allow it. The second wave hit our eastern perimeter first, where Olivia Marsh and 2 others were dug into a reinforced position built from stacked supply containers. I described to the council how enemy infantry advanced in tight formation, confident after studying whatever fragments of data survived from the first assault. Olivia did not wait for them to reach effective range. She had spent the 72 hours before the attack calculating exact distances along the open ground, marking them with small painted stones only our side could recognize. When the enemy crossed the first marker, she opened fire with everything she had, and the formation broke apart within seconds. I watched several council members lean forward as I described this. Marshal Yoren in particular seemed unable to stay still, his mandibles clicking softly in a rhythm I now understood as something close to frustration. "Your soldier exploited terrain markers unavailable to standard defensive doctrine," the marshal said. "That is a tactical advantage, not evidence of extraordinary combat capability." "You're right," I said. "It was a tactical advantage, but it only worked because Olivia had already decided, days earlier, that she would use every hour available to prepare, rather than rest. That decision is not something your simulations account for, because your simulations assume soldiers behave the way soldiers are expected to behave. We did not always behave that way." I continued the story, describing how the fighting spread along the entire perimeter within minutes. Noah and Olivia held the east side, using the old turrets rebuilt during those final 72 hours to slow the enemy advance long enough for the rest of us to reposition. Marcus commanded from the central bunker, coordinating movement across all three defensive lines with a calm voice that never once cracked, even as the numbers reported to him grew worse by the hour. Grace moved between positions under fire, treating injuries as they happened, refusing to remain in the relative safety of the medical bay while her squad mates bled in the open. I paused here, because this was the point in the story where I had to speak about the first loss, and even after 3 months, the words did not come easily. "We lost our first soldier 6 hours into the second wave," I said. "His name was Julian Ford. He was covering the western trench line, holding a position that should have had 3 defenders but only had 2, because the third had been pulled to reinforce the east. He held that line alone for almost 20 minutes before backup arrived." The chamber was silent. I did not describe the details of how Julian fell. I did not think the council needed that, and I did not think Julian deserved to be remembered that way. Instead, I told them what he had done in those 20 minutes, how his position had absorbed an assault meant to break through and reach the depot's fuel storage directly, how his refusal to abandon that trench had bought the rest of us enough time to reinforce the entire western line before it collapsed. "After Julian fell," I said, "something changed in the rest of us. I want to be careful how I explain this, because I do not want you to think we became something inhuman. We did not stop feeling fear. We did not stop feeling grief. What changed was how we used those feelings. Instead of letting them slow us down, we let them sharpen everything we did." Administrator Vell studied me with an expression I still could not fully read. "You are describing an emotional response converting directly into combat efficiency." "I'm describing something simpler than that," I said. "We had already decided, before any of this started, exactly what we were willing to give for that outpost and for each other. Julian's loss did not create a new decision. It confirmed the one we had already made. And once that decision is confirmed, soldiers do not fight the way your models expect them to fight. They fight like people with nothing left to calculate." I told the council how the second wave ultimately failed, not because we destroyed every enemy unit that reached our perimeter, but because the cost of continuing the assault became too high for their commanders to justify. By the time the enemy pulled back at dusk, we had held every inch of the outer fence line, though at a price that left 3 of us wounded badly enough that Grace had to perform field treatment under active fire. "That night was the only quiet period during the entire siege," I said. 4 hours of near silence, broken only by distant movement from the enemy staging area beyond our sensor range. We used that time to reinforce what remained of our defenses, to check on each other, and to prepare for whatever came next, because none of us believed the fighting was finished. I described how Marcus gathered the surviving squad in the central bunker during that brief window, how he did not give a speech, because none of us needed one. Instead, he simply asked each person, one at a time, if they were still willing to hold the line. Every answer was the same. Every voice, even the ones shaking from exhaustion, said yes. "I want the council to understand something important here," I said, looking around the table. "That question was not asked because Marcus doubted us. It was asked because he respected us enough to make sure the choice remained ours. Nobody was forced to keep fighting. Every single person who continued through the following days chose to continue, again and again, even when the cost of that choice became clearer with every passing hour. Marshal Yoren made a low sound that the translator rendered as something between a sigh and a growl. This is precisely the variable our models fail to capture. Willingness is not a measurable input in standard combat projection. It should be, I said, because it was the single largest factor in everything that happened on Karn. I moved the story forward, describing the early hours of the second day, when enemy scouts returned in smaller numbers, testing weakened sections of our perimeter rather than launching another full assault. I explained how Olivia identified a pattern in their movements within the first hour, noticing that scout units were avoiding areas near our rebuilt turret positions, which told us the enemy had learned to fear the very defenses we built from scrap during those final 72 hours before the attack. We used that fear, I admitted to the council. We moved dummy equipment into open positions to make our defenses appear stronger than they actually were in certain sections, drawing enemy attention away from weaker points along the perimeter. It was not sophisticated. It did not require advanced technology. It required understanding how a frightened enemy behaves and using that understanding against them. I explained how the depot's remaining defenders divided their limited resources with careful precision during this period, rationing ammunition, water, and rest in shifts that allowed at least half the squad to remain functional at any given time. Grace managed this rotation as carefully as she managed medical care, understanding that exhaustion would eventually become as dangerous to us as the enemy outside the fence. By midday of the second day, I told the council, Command finally responded to our repeated requests for status updates. The message was brief. Reinforcements had been authorized, but the nearest available fleet remained 3 days out due to a separate engagement along another section of the frontier. 3 more days. We had already survived 1 full day of continuous assault, and the message asking us to survive 3 more arrived not as an order, but as a request, because Command understood there was no way to guarantee it. Marcus read that message aloud to all of us, I said, and I remember exactly what he said afterward. He said 3 days was simply a number, and numbers could be changed by the choices we made in every single hour between now and then. I described how the squad received this news, not with panic, but with a strange, quiet determination that I still find difficult to explain to anyone who was not there. Noah, the youngest among us, was the first to speak after Marcus finished. He said he had signed up to be a Marine because he wanted to matter to something bigger than himself, and if this was the moment that mattered, he intended to make it count. I share that memory with the council, I said, because I want you to understand something about the number you asked me to give you. It was never generated by weapons alone. It was generated by 12 people who kept renewing a decision they had already made, hour after hour, day after day, long after any reasonable model would have predicted surrender or collapse. Vel leaned back slightly, its silver eyes fixed on me with an intensity that had not been there at the start of our meeting. You are telling this council that the defenders of Karn essentially refused to acknowledge the probability of defeat. I'm telling you we simply never calculated it, I said. There is a difference between refusing to see the odds and never once stopping to ask what the odds were, because asking would have cost us time we did not have and focus we could not spare. Every minute we spent surviving was a minute we could not spend imagining failure. The chamber remained silent for a long moment after that, and I let it stay that way, because I could see something shifting in the expressions around that table, something that had not been there when this meeting began. The third wave arrived that evening, I said finally, and I watched the council brace itself, because they understood, perhaps for the first time, that the numbers they had studied for 3 months were about to become real people in front of them. And it was unlike anything that came before it. The third wave did not test our defenses. It came to erase them. I told the council that enemy commanders had clearly abandoned their earlier strategy by this point, choosing instead to commit a force nearly equal to the entire garrison that had originally been assigned to secure Karn. Sensors detected the buildup hours before the assault began, giving us time to prepare, though preparation had started to mean something different by then. We were no longer building new defenses. We were simply deciding how to use what little we had left. Marcus gathered the squad one final time before the attack began. By this point, our numbers had already dropped. Julian was gone. 2 others carried injuries serious enough to limit their movement, though neither was willing to remain in the medical bay while the rest of us held the line. I explained to the council that this refusal was not born from recklessness. It came from something closer to loyalty, a belief that showing up mattered more than being at full strength. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that settles into a person after continuous engagement, I said. It does not feel like tiredness in the way most people understand it. It feels like your body running on decisions instead of energy. Every action becomes deliberate, because nothing happens automatically anymore. I want the council to understand that state, because it defined everything that happened during the third wave. I described how the assault began just after dusk, when enemy transports dropped in coordinated patterns designed to overwhelm every section of our perimeter simultaneously. There would be no isolated skirmishes this time, no single trench line absorbing the weight of the attack while others held steady. The entire outpost came under pressure at once. Grace remained in the central bunker during the opening minutes, monitoring communications and preparing emergency treatment stations in 3 separate locations, understanding that casualties would likely occur faster than she could reach them individually. I explained to the council that this decision, made quickly and without hesitation, saved lives during the hours that followed, because it meant help was never more than a short distance away, no matter where the fighting concentrated. Noah held the eastern position again, this time alongside a soldier named Felix Grant, a quiet man who rarely spoke unless necessary, but who had proven, over the previous 2 days, to be one of the steadiest shots among us. I told the council how the 2 of them coordinated, without needing to communicate constantly, each anticipating the other's movements after nearly 48 hours of fighting side by side. This kind of coordination, I explained, does not come from training alone. It comes from shared experience under pressure, from trusting someone with your life so many times that trust becomes instinct. The Western Trench, where Julian had fallen the day before, was now held by Olivia and a soldier named Ruby Sinclair, who had transferred from the southern perimeter once it became clear the western line needed reinforcement. I described how Ruby, upon arriving at the position, spent several minutes studying the terrain before saying a single word to Olivia. She simply said, "Ready," and that was enough. I paused here, looking around the council chamber, and I told them something I had not planned to say, though it felt necessary in that moment. I want you to understand that none of the people I am describing were extraordinary before this happened. They were not chosen because of unusual skill or unusual courage. They became what they were during those 6 days because the situation demanded it, and each of them, individually, decided to meet that demand rather than fall short of it. Marshal Yoren's mandibles clicked softly, though this time the sound seemed less like disbelief and more like something closer to reflection. You are suggesting the pressure of the engagement itself produced capabilities that did not previously exist. I'm suggesting pressure reveals capabilities that already existed but had never been tested, I said. Every person on that outpost had that capacity within them before the fighting started. The siege simply forced it to the surface. I continued describing the third wave, explaining how the fighting intensified across every section of the perimeter within the first 30 minutes. Enemy forces broke through a portion of the southern fence line roughly an hour into the assault, forcing Marcus to redirect 2 soldiers from reserve positions to contain the breach before it could widen. I described the chaos of that moment carefully, without exaggeration, because I wanted the council to understand it as it actually happened, rather than as some dramatic turning point invented for effect. The breach was contained, but not without cost. A soldier named Priya Nolan, who had spent much of the siege managing our limited communications equipment, was among those sent to reinforce the southern line. I told the council that Priya's technical skill had kept our systems functioning far longer than they should have, given the age of our equipment and the damage sustained during the previous 2 waves. When the call came for reinforcements, she did not hesitate, even though close combat had never been her primary role. I explained that Priya held the breach alongside another soldier long enough for Marcus to organize a proper counter to the incursion, and that her actions during those critical minutes prevented enemy forces from reaching the depot's inner supply lines. I did not describe, in detail, what happened to her afterward. I simply told the council that she did not walk away from that position, and that her name deserved to be remembered by anyone studying what occurred at Karn. The room remained silent for a long moment after I said this. I let it stay that way, because grief, even shared secondhand, needed space to exist before the story could continue. After the southern breach was sealed, I said eventually, the fighting did not slow down. If anything, it intensified, because enemy commanders seemed to understand that a full breakthrough was still possible if pressure remained constant across every line at once. I described the following hours in detail, explaining how each defensive position adapted independently to whatever pressure it faced, without waiting for centralized instructions that could not always arrive in time. Noah and Felix, holding the eastern line, developed a rotation system between shots that allowed one to reload while the other maintained continuous suppression, a technique neither of them had been taught but had discovered together through necessity. Olivia and Ruby, on the western line, used the terrain markers Olivia had created days earlier to funnel advancing enemy units into narrow approach paths where limited ammunition could be used with maximum effect. I explained to the council that none of these adaptations were revolutionary from a tactical standpoint. Any trained soldier from any species might arrive at similar solutions given enough time and pressure. What set our situation apart, I said, was not the sophistication of these adaptations, but the speed at which exhausted, wounded people continued producing them, hour after hour, without any indication that their capacity to think and adjust was diminishing. Your models likely predict a decline in tactical effectiveness as fatigue and casualties accumulate, I said, looking directly at Marshal Yoren. That decline did occur among us, physically, but it did not occur in decision-making, and I believe that distinction is central to understanding the number you asked me for. Vel's silver eyes remained fixed on me throughout this portion of the account, and when it finally spoke, its voice carried a quality I had not heard from it before, something closer to genuine uncertainty rather than the flat authority it had used at the start of our meeting. You are describing sustained cognitive performance under conditions that should have produced significant degradation, Vel said. Our medical projections for comparable species suggest severe decision-making impairment after continuous engagement exceeding 12 hours. You are describing performance maintained across days. I'm describing exactly that, I said, and I do not have a scientific explanation for why it happened the way it did. I only know that it happened because I lived through it, and because every surviving record from Karn confirms the same pattern across every defensive position. I moved the story into its final stretch before the third wave's conclusion, describing how enemy commanders eventually attempted a concentrated push directly toward the central bunker, apparently recognizing that Marcus's coordination was the element holding our fragmented defenses together. I explained how this push forced nearly every remaining defender to converge on a single point, abandoning individual positions temporarily to protect the heart of our command structure. This was the moment, I told the council, when the fighting became something closer to what I imagined their own historical accounts of desperate defense might resemble. 12 people, reduced now to 9, standing shoulder to shoulder around a small concrete structure, facing an advancing force that outnumbered us by a margin too large to calculate in any meaningful way. I described how Grace, who had spent most of the siege treating injuries rather than engaging directly, took up a position alongside the rest of us during those final minutes of the third wave, understanding that the medical bay would mean nothing if the central bunker fell. I told the council that her presence in that line, calm and steady despite having spent nearly 70 hours without meaningful rest, became something the rest of us drew strength from. A reminder that every person on that field had already given everything they had to give, and continued giving regardless. "I will not pretend that moment was without fear," I said. Every one of us understood, standing there, that we might not survive the next few minutes. But understanding that possibility, and being controlled by it, are two very different things. We had already made our decision days earlier. That night simply asked us to honor it one more time. I explained that the push against the central bunker ultimately failed, not because we possessed some overwhelming advantage, but because the concentrated defense, built from 9 exhausted people who trusted each other completely, proved harder to break than the enemy's scattered assault across a wider perimeter had been. Marcus directed our fire with precision, born from 2 days of continuous command decisions, and Olivia's understanding of the terrain allowed her to identify weaknesses in the enemy's advance that the rest of us used to devastating effect. By the time the third wave finally withdrew, deep into the night, only 9 of us remained standing, though every single one of us carried injuries that would have justified stepping back from the line entirely under different circumstances. None of us stepped back. "I share these details with the Council not to glorify what happened," I said, my voice steady despite the weight of the memory. "I share them because they are the actual origin of the number you came here to obtain. That number was never generated by superior weapons or superior technology. It was generated by 9 exhausted people who refused to stop making the same decision they had made on the very first night of the siege, over and over again, for as long as their bodies allowed it." Administrator Vell was quiet for a long moment, its silver eyes distant, as though processing something far larger than the words I had just spoken. When it finally addressed me again, its voice had lost nearly all of its earlier authority, replaced by something that sounded, unmistakably, like genuine concern. "How many of the original 12 remained when the 4th day began?" Vell asked quietly. I looked at the Council, and I answered honestly, because there was no reason left to soften what had happened. 6, I said. 6 of us remained when the 4th day began. And that was before the fighting truly turned against us. 6 people cannot hold a perimeter built for 12, and every one of us understood that fact the moment the 4th day began. I explained to the Council that Marcus made the hardest decision of the entire siege that morning. Rather than attempting to defend the full outer fence line, he ordered a full withdrawal to a smaller, tighter perimeter surrounding the depot's central structures. It meant giving up ground we had bled to protect for 3 straight days. It also meant the 6 of us remaining might actually survive long enough to see reinforcements arrive. I told the Council how strange that morning felt, moving through positions we had defended so fiercely, dismantling equipment we had built with our own hands, knowing the enemy would occupy that same ground within hours. Noah asked Marcus quietly whether pulling back meant we had failed. I remembered Marcus's answer clearly, because it stayed with me through everything that followed. He said failure would have meant losing the depot entirely. Adjusting our position to keep fighting was not failure. It was simply what survival required. By midday, our new perimeter was established, smaller and easier to defend, but offering far less room for error. Grace had relocated the medical bay into the depot's central storage building, the most heavily reinforced structure remaining on site. Olivia and Ruby held the northern approach, the only clear path large enough for a coordinated enemy advance. Noah and Felix covered the eastern flank, where broken terrain from the previous day's fighting created natural obstacles that slowed any approach. Marcus and I held the southern position together, the last line before the depot's fuel reserves. I explained to the Council that Command finally confirmed a firm timeline that morning. Reinforcements were now less than 18 hours away. 18 hours felt, at the time, like both an impossibly long stretch and an almost merciful mercy compared to the uncertainty we had endured for the previous 3 days. "I want the Council to understand something about that number," I said. 18 hours is nothing, in the context of a normal life. It passes without notice most days, but measured in continuous combat, exhausted beyond anything I can properly describe, 18 hours became the entire world. Every one of us reorganized our understanding of time around that single number, because it was the only thing standing between survival and loss. The fourth wave arrived less than 3 hours after our new perimeter was established, smaller in overall numbers than the third wave but composed almost entirely of specialized units, clearly intended to break through quickly rather than grind us down through attrition. I explained to the Council that this shift in enemy tactics told its own story. Whatever calculations their commanders had been running, our continued resistance had apparently convinced them that a prolonged siege was no longer worth the cost, and a swift, decisive strike had become the priority. I described the assault on the northern approach first, where Olivia and Ruby faced the heaviest concentration of enemy forces. I told the Council how the two of them, having fought together for 3 straight days by that point, moved with a coordination that no formal training program could have produced, each anticipating the other's next action without needing to speak. Their position held for nearly 2 hours against sustained pressure, buying critical time for the rest of us to hold our own lines. It was during this stretch of fighting that Ruby fell. I did not describe the specific circumstances in detail to the Council, because doing so would have served no purpose beyond causing unnecessary pain. I simply told them that Ruby's actions in her final minutes allowed Olivia to reposition to a stronger location, one that ultimately held for the remainder of the assault. I told them Ruby's name mattered, the same way Julian's and Priya's names mattered, because behind every number on their reports was a person who had chosen, again and again, to remain in a position they could have abandoned. I paused for a long moment after saying this, and I noticed Administrator Vell had lowered its gaze slightly, an expression I had come to understand, over the course of our conversation, as something close to respect. "Continue," Vell said softly, when I did not immediately resume speaking. I told the Council about the eastern flank next, where Noah and Felix faced a smaller but more determined enemy push, one that seemed designed to test whether the broken terrain could be navigated despite its obstacles. I explained how Felix, who had said so little throughout the entire siege, spoke almost constantly during this engagement, calling out enemy positions and coordinating movement with a precision that surprised even Noah, who had fought alongside him for days by that point. I described how the eastern flank held, though barely, with both soldiers sustaining injuries that would have ended the engagement for almost any other unit under almost any other circumstances. I explained to the Council that neither Noah nor Felix considered withdrawing, even when ordered by Marcus to fall back and regroup at the central position. Their refusal was not defiance, it was a shared understanding that the eastern flank, if abandoned, would expose the entire remaining perimeter to a flanking maneuver that could end the engagement for everyone. They held that line, I said, because they understood something that I believe your models consistently underestimate. A soldier who understands exactly what their position means to everyone else around them will hold that position far longer than pure survival instinct would predict. Marshal Yoren, who had remained largely silent during this portion of the account, finally spoke again, his voice quieter than it had been earlier in our meeting. "You are describing a form of collective calculation, each individual soldier weighing the value of their position against the survival of the group as a whole." "That's close to accurate," I said, though I do not think any of us were consciously calculating anything by that point. It had become instinct, built from 3 days of watching each other make the same choice, over and over, without exception. I moved the story toward its most difficult stretch, describing how Marcus and I held the southern position together as the fourth wave's pressure gradually shifted toward our line. Once enemy commanders recognized the northern and eastern approaches were not yielding results quickly enough. I told the Council how Marcus, even after 3 days of continuous command decisions and physical exhaustion that should have made clear thought nearly impossible, remained precise and calm, directing our limited resources with the same steady confidence he had shown from the very first hour of the siege. I explained to the Council, honestly and without exaggeration, that I do not fully remember every detail of the fighting along the southern line during those final hours. Continuous engagement does strange things to memory, compressing some moments into vivid clarity while blurring others entirely. What I remember clearly is Marcus's voice, steady beside me, calling out adjustments and encouragement in equal measure, refusing to let either of us believe, even for a moment, that our position could not hold. It was during the final hour of the fourth wave that Marcus fell. I told the council this plainly, without embellishment, because Marcus deserved to be remembered accurately rather than dramatically. He had led us from the very first meeting in that mess hall with cold coffee, through every decision that followed, always steady, always certain that holding the line mattered more than any personal cost it required. His final act was directing me toward a defensible position after our southern line began to buckle under concentrated pressure, ensuring that I, at least, would have a chance to continue holding it. I did not speak for a long moment after telling the council this. The chamber remained silent, respectful of a pause I had not asked for but clearly needed. When I finally continued, my voice was quieter than it had been throughout the rest of the account. After Marcus fell, I held the southern position alone, I said. Grace remained in the central storage building, treating those who could still be treated. Noah and Felix continued holding the eastern flank, though both were wounded badly enough that continued fighting was becoming increasingly difficult. Olivia held the northern approach by herself, having lost Ruby hours earlier. I explained to the council that this was the moment the siege of Karn Outpost became something different from everything that had come before it. It was no longer a coordinated defense executed by a full squad working together. It was 4 exhausted, wounded people spread across a perimeter that had already been reduced twice, holding separate positions with almost no ability to reinforce one another. I want to be honest with this council about what that felt like, I said, looking directly at Vel. It did not feel heroic. It did not feel like the kind of moment your reports describe in clinical, distant language. It felt like exhaustion beyond anything I believed a human body could endure. It felt like grief pressing against every decision I tried to make, and it felt, more than anything else, like refusing to let that grief become the reason the depot finally fell. I described the final hours of the fourth wave in careful detail, explaining how each of us, isolated at our separate positions, continued making the same choice we had made on the first night of the siege, without any guarantee that choice would matter, without any certainty that reinforcements would actually arrive in time. Reinforcements arrived 4 hours later, I said finally. 4 of us were still standing when the first coalition transport entered orbit above Karn. I let that number settle over the chamber, because I understood, watching the expressions around that table shift and change, that this was the moment the council finally began to understand what they had actually summoned me here to explain. You asked me for a kill ratio, I said quietly. I have given you nearly every detail of how that number came to exist, but I do not think you fully understand it yet, not completely, because the number itself is not the answer to your question. The real answer is still ahead of us, and I believe you are finally ready to hear it. The chamber remained silent for a long moment after I finished describing the fourth wave, and I let that silence continue, because I understood something now that I had not fully understood when this meeting began. These beings, leaders of a coalition that had survived centuries of conflict, had never once heard the actual story behind a report. They had only ever seen the numbers, clean and distant, stripped of everything that made those numbers true. Administrator Vel finally broke the silence, its voice quieter than at any point during our conversation. You said reinforcements arrived 4 hours after Marcus fell. 4 of the original 12 remained standing at that point. That's correct, I said. And yet, Vel continued, the official record indicates all 12 names from the initial garrison assignment are listed among the defenders credited with holding Karn Outpost. Explain this discrepancy. I nodded, because this was exactly the question I had been waiting for someone on that council to ask. There is no discrepancy, I said. Every one of the 12 held that outpost. From the first minute of the siege, until the moment reinforcements arrived. Some of them held it standing beside me until the very end. Others held it through decisions they made hours or even days earlier, decisions that continued protecting the rest of us, long after they were no longer there to see the outcome. Julian held that outpost by buying us 20 minutes on the first night that let the rest of us reinforce our position. Priya held it by sealing a breach that would have ended everything hours before it did. Ruby held it by giving Olivia the ground she needed to keep the northern approach from collapsing. Marcus held it by making every decision that kept the rest of us alive long enough to keep fighting. I paused, looking around the table at every member of the council in turn. "You want a kill ratio," I said. "I understand why. It is a number your systems can process, compare, and file away. But if I give you that number without everything I have just told you, you will misunderstand it completely, the same way your analysts have misunderstood it for 3 months already." Marshal Yoren leaned forward, his mandibles still now, his full attention fixed on me in a way it had not been since our conversation began. "Then give us the number, and give us your interpretation alongside it. We are listening, human." I took a slow breath, and I gave them the number, exactly as it appeared in the official Coalition combat report, without exaggeration or omission. The figure was large enough that several council members shifted visibly in their seats when I said it aloud, a ratio so disproportionate to the size of our original garrison that it defied nearly every model their strategists had built for predicting combat outcomes involving similarly sized defending forces. "That is the number," I said, once the silence following it had stretched long enough. "But I want to explain what it actually represents, because I do not believe it represents what your council believes it represents." Vel tilted its head, waiting. "Your analysts have spent 3 months trying to determine what made Earth Marines exceptionally effective at Karn," I said. "They have studied our weapons, our training programs, our physical conditioning, searching for the specific variable that explains a ratio this extreme. I do not believe that variable exists in the way you are looking for it, because you are searching in the wrong place entirely." "Where would you have us search instead?" Vel asked. "You would have to search inside each of us individually," I said. "Because the number you are chasing was never produced by a system. It was produced 12 separate times, by 12 separate people, each of whom decided independently that the outpost mattered more than their own safety, and then renewed that decision continuously, hour after hour, for as long as their bodies allowed them to act on it. That decision is not something you can train into a soldier through doctrine. It is not something you can install through better equipment. It has to already exist within the person, and the situation simply has to demand it be revealed." I explained to the council that this was precisely why their simulations failed to reproduce anything close to the outcome at Karn. Their models, built on centuries of data from countless species and countless engagements, correctly predicted how equipment, terrain, and numerical superiority would interact under standard conditions. What their models could not account for was a defending force that never calculated the odds of failure at all, because doing so would have required stepping back from the fight, even briefly, and none of us believed we had that luxury. I do not say this to suggest humans are somehow superior to every species represented at this table, I said carefully, because I did not want the council to misunderstand my intent. I believe every species has individuals capable of the same commitment we showed at Karn. What I believe is unusual about humans, based on everything I have witnessed across my service, is how consistently that commitment appears. Once a group decides, together, that a position is worth holding regardless of cost, it becomes contagious. One person's refusal to quit makes it easier for the next person to refuse as well, and that effect compounds across an entire unit, until the group becomes something considerably more difficult to defeat than the sum of its individual members would suggest. Marshal Yoren was quiet for a long moment, processing what I had said. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the skepticism it had held at the start of our meeting. "You are suggesting the kill ratio for one Earth Marine cannot be treated as a fixed value applicable across future engagements." "That's exactly what I'm suggesting," I said. The number I gave you is accurate for Karn. It reflects what happened there, under those specific conditions, with those specific people. But it is not a constant you can apply to every human soldier in every future situation, because the number was never really about combat skill in the first place. It was a measurement of how much 12 particular people were willing to endure before they would consider stopping, and I do not believe there is a reliable way to predict that in advance, for us or for any other species, until the moment actually arrives and forces the answer into the open. Administrator Vell sat back slowly, its silver eyes distant, clearly turning something over that extended far beyond the specific data point our meeting had originally been called to resolve. When it spoke again, its voice had lost every trace of the flat, clinical tone it carried when our conversation began. This council convened this meeting believing we required a statistic, Vell said. I understand now that the statistic was never the actual subject of our inquiry. We were attempting to measure something considerably larger than combat efficiency, and I do not believe our existing frameworks are equipped to properly contain it. I think that's the most honest thing anyone in this chamber has said since I arrived, I said, and for the first time since entering the room, I allowed myself something close to a small, tired smile. I told the council, in the final portion of my account, what happened after reinforcements arrived at Karn. I described the exhaustion that overtook the four of us the moment we finally understood the outpost was secure, an exhaustion so complete that Grace later told me she did not fully remember the transport ride back to the nearest medical facility. I described the quiet ceremony held 3 weeks later, honoring all 12 members of the original garrison, where I stood beside Grace, Noah, and Olivia, the only 4 of us who returned, and read the names of the 8 who did not. I share that memory with the council, not because I want sympathy, I said, but because I want you to understand that the number you asked me for came at a cost that no ratio can properly represent. 8 names. 8 people who made the same decision the rest of us made and who did not get the chance to see it through to the end. I looked around the table one final time, meeting the eyes, or whatever passed for eyes, of every representative present. You asked me what the kill ratio is for one Earth Marine, I said. I have given you the number from Karn, and I have given you everything that number actually represents. If your council intends to use this data to predict future engagements involving human forces, I would caution you against treating it as a fixed constant. Treat it instead as evidence of what becomes possible when a group of people decide, together, that a position matters more than their own survival, and then refuse to reconsider that decision, no matter what the following hours demand of them. That is not a number your systems can reliably generate in advance. It is something that reveals itself only when it is tested, and I hope, for the sake of everyone in this coalition, that it is tested as rarely as possible going forward. Administrator Vell rose slowly from its seat, a gesture that seemed to carry significant formal weight within coalition custom, judging by the way the rest of the council responded in kind. This council thanks you for your account, Ethan Cole. We came here seeking a number. We are leaving with a considerably more complete understanding of what that number required. I nodded once, and I allowed myself, finally, to feel the full weight of everything I had just spoken aloud for the first time since Karn. It did not lessen the grief. I do not believe it ever fully will. But I understood, walking out of that chamber, that Marcus, Julian, Priya, Ruby, and the 4 others who did not return home would not be remembered by the coalition as a statistic buried in a report nobody outside a war council would ever read. They would be remembered as the reason a number that shook an entire war council finally made sense. And for the first time in 3 months, that felt like enough.